Look down a long, quiet street in Portland, Oregon, in the early years of the 20th century. The sky is heavy and gray, and the wooden sidewalks gleam from the morning's rain. Trolley cars hum softly in the distance, their bells echoing off brick buildings. In a small neighborhood near the river, a boy watches the world through the window of his father's pharmacy. He sees the amber bottles lined up like soldiers, each filled with something mysterious. The light coming through the glass is warm and golden, making the liquids glow like captured sunshine. The boy is Linus Pauling, and he is already noticing how things fit together. His father, Herman, moves quietly behind the counter, mixing powders and herbs with the calm precision of a man who understands that healing takes time. The air smells of lavender, alcohol, and something sweet he cannot name. Linus presses his nose against the cool glass of the display case, watching the tiny reflections of himself and his father in the polished wood. This pharmacy is not just a store, it is Linus's first laboratory. He sees his father measure, weigh, and blend, transforming raw materials into remedies. There is a quiet magic in this daily ritual, a kind of alchemy that makes sense of the world. Long before he will understand atoms and molecules, he understands care. He sees neighbors come in with tired eyes and leave with small wrapped parcels that promise relief. His father's hands are gentle, and his voice is soft. In the evenings, after the shop closes, Linus helps wipe down the counters and watches the last light fade through the frosted windows. The streets outside grow still, and the gas lamps flicker to life one by one. This is a city of mist and gentle hills, where rain taps on rooftops like a lullaby. Linus carries the quiet order of the pharmacy into his dreams, where glass bottles float like planets in a calm, golden space. But the world does not stay still for long. When Linus is only 9 years old, his father falls ill and dies, leaving the family with a quiet grief that settles over everything like dust. The pharmacy is sold, and the glowing bottles disappear from his life. Linus now walks the streets of Portland alone, past damp gardens and empty lots where wildflowers push through the cracks. He collects insects and rocks, studying their shapes with an intensity that sets him apart from other children. The natural world becomes his laboratory. He notices how sunlight filters through the leaves of the big leaf maples, scattering patterns on the ground like a secret code. He spends hours in the attic of his family's modest house, reading every book he can find, from adventure stories to chemistry primers. The attic window is small and round, and in the afternoon it casts a single beam of light that moves slowly across the floorboards. Linus follows it with his eyes, lost in thought. This attic is his refuge, a quiet space above the world where he can assemble his own understanding of things. He builds simple experiments with jars and wires, replicating what he reads about. One day, a friend shows him a chemistry set, and Linus is overcome with the same wonder he felt in his father's pharmacy. He begs his mother to let him use the kitchen for experiments, and soon the house fills with the faint smells of sulfur and soap. His mother, Belle, is a stern but loving woman who works long hours running a boarding house to support the family. The boarding house is a place of constant, gentle motion, footsteps on stairs, the clink of dishes, soft conversations in the parlor. Linus learns to work quietly, to observe without disturbing. He notices how water boils differently in a copper pot versus an iron one, cataloging these differences in his mind like treasures. By the time he enters high school, Linus has already decided to become a chemical engineer. He walks to school each morning along streets lined with chestnut trees, their branches forming a green tunnel over his head. He carries a notebook in which he sketches molecular structures, though he does not yet know that is what they are. He simply draws the patterns he sees in nature, the spiral of a snail shell, the branching of a fern, the hexagonal cells of a honeycomb he once found in a hollow tree. The school building is a sturdy brick structure with tall windows that let in the cool, gray light of the Pacific Northwest. In a corner of the science classroom, Linus finds a worn copy of a chemistry textbook, and its pages become his gateway to a larger world. The diagrams seem to glow under the dim electric lights, promising secrets he is only beginning to grasp. Outside, the rain continues its gentle rhythm, washing the sidewalks clean for the next day's footsteps. At 16, Linus is ready for college, but his family needs money. So he takes a series of quiet jobs, working as a delivery boy, a machinist's helper, and even a movie projectionist. The projection booth is a small, dark room filled with the warm hum of machinery and the sharp scent of hot film. Through the tiny window, Linus watches silent images flicker across the screen, stories told in light and shadow. He learns to be patient, to tend machines with care, and to find joy in the steady, reliable click of the projector. This rhythm reminds him of the heartbeat of the world, a pattern he will one day seek in the very structure of matter. After saving enough money, he enrolls at Oregon Agricultural College in Corvallis, a place of open fields and quiet brick buildings nestled in the Willamette Valley. The train ride from Portland takes him through farmlands veined with misty rivers, and he watches the landscape unfold like a slow, beautiful dream. He arrives in Corvallis on a cool September morning, stepping onto the platform with a small suitcase and a heart full of quiet determination. The campus is calm and green, with old oak trees spreading their branches over pathways of pressed gravel. The main building is a stately structure of red brick and white columns, its steps worn smooth by generations of students. Inside, the hallways smell of floor wax and chalk dust. Linus finds his room in a modest boarding house near the edge of campus, a simple space with a wooden desk, a brass lamp, and a window that looks out onto a meadow where cows graze in the golden afternoon light. He unpacks his few books and sets his notebook on the desk, already feeling the pull of the laboratory down the hill. That night, as he lies in bed listening to the distant sound of a train whistle, he feels the deep peace of arriving exactly where he is meant to be. The journey of his mind is just beginning, and soon he will see what no one has seen before. The moon rises over the Coast Range, a pale, quiet presence, and Linus falls asleep to the rustle of leaves outside his window. Wake now in the soft, gray light of an Oregon morning in 1917. The Willamette Valley is still asleep under a blanket of mist. In the modest boarding house near the college, Linus Pauling opens his eyes to the sound of sparrows chattering in the eaves. He washes his face with cool water from a porcelain basin and dresses quietly, careful not to disturb the other boarders. Downstairs, the landlady has set out a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, and the kitchen window frames a view of the meadow where the fog lifts slowly, revealing the oak trees one branch at a time. Linus eats quickly, his mind already turning over the puzzles of his chemistry lectures. He walks to campus along a path that cuts through fields of tall grass, his leather shoes darkening with dew. The air is cool and sweet with the scent of earth and clover. In the distance, the campus buildings rise like ships in the haze, their red brick glowing softly as the sun begins to break through. The chemistry laboratory at Oregon Agricultural College is a long, narrow room on the second floor of the science building. Windows line one wall, looking out onto a courtyard where a single magnolia tree stands in full bloom. Inside, the benches are scarred with the marks of countless experiments, and the air carries the sharp, clean smell of reagents. Linus arrives early each day to claim his favorite spot, a bench near the window where the morning light falls directly onto his work. He sets out his glassware with the care of a craftsman, arranging beakers and test tubes in precise rows. His professor, a gentle man named John Fulton, notices the intensity in the young student's eyes and gives him extra problems to solve. Linus bends over his notebook, recording measurements in a neat, tiny script. The only sounds are the scratch of his pen, the distant hum of bees outside the open window, and the soft gurgle of a distillation apparatus on the next bench. Hours pass without him noticing, the light shifting from cool white to warm gold across the tiled floor. He discovers here, in this calm laboratory, the joy of quantitative analysis. He learns to measure the weight of a precipitate with an almost spiritual reverence, understanding that these tiny numbers contain truths about the universe. In the afternoons, when the lab is empty, he stays behind to read the journals stacked on a dusty shelf. He discovers the works of Gilbert Lewis and Irving Langmuir, pioneers who are rewriting the rules of chemical bonding. Their ideas strike him like a quiet revelation, not as a thunderclap, but as a slow sunrise. He sits on a high stool by the window, the magnolia blossoms casting faint shadows on the pages, and traces the diagrams with his fingertip. Outside, students walk by in twos and threes, their laughter muffled by the glass. Linus hears nothing. He is floating in a sea of electrons, imagining them as tiny points of light arranging themselves in spaces no one has ever seen. The world becomes a dance of invisible architecture, and he is learning its first steps. Weekends in Corvallis bring a different kind of education. Linus hikes alone into the Coast Range foothills, following logging roads that wind through forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The trees are enormous, their trunks disappearing upward into a canopy that filters the sunlight into shafts of green and gold. He walks slowly, picking up interesting stones and examining the strata of exposed cliffs. Nature, he realizes, is the original chemist, assembling crystals and minerals in ways that human laboratories cannot yet replicate. He sits on a fallen log to eat his lunch, bread and an apple, and reads a book of poetry he brought along. The words blend with the sound of a nearby creek, and for a moment everything feels connected, the atomic, the earthly, the human. As evening approaches, he wanders back to town, the sky softening into bands of rose and lavender. The lights of Corvallis twinkle on, a warm constellation spreading across the valley floor. He enters the boarding house, his shoes dusty, his pockets full of pebbles, and his heart full of a quiet, enormous contentment. It is at the college that Linus meets the person who will shape the rest of his life. Her name is Ava Helen Miller, and she is a student in the home economics program, though her mind ranges far beyond the domestic. They meet in the library, a grand room with tall windows and the smell of old paper. Ava Helen is reading under a green-shaded lamp, and the light catches the copper tones in her hair. Linus, shy and unaccustomed to conversation with young women, approaches her with a question about the Dewey Decimal System. Their talk drifts from books to chemistry to the beauty of an Oregon sunset, and Linus feels a new kind of bond forming, one as real and mysterious as the chemical bonds he studies. They begin to take walks together through the campus arboretum, down paths bordered by rhododendrons that bloom in brilliant pinks and purples. Their conversations are quiet and steady, filled with long silences that feel comfortable rather than awkward. Under the spreading branches of a giant sequoia, Linus tells Ava Helen about his dream of understanding the very nature of the chemical bond, and she listens with a seriousness that makes him feel seen. As his college years draw to a close, Linus knows he must continue his studies. He applies to the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, a place where the sun shines almost every day and the laboratories are among the best in the world. The day his acceptance letter arrives is an Oregon spring day of perfect clarity, the sky a deep, cloudless blue, the meadows bursting with camas lilies. He stands on the porch of the boarding house, holding the envelope with trembling hands, and reads the words that will change his life. Ava Helen stands beside him, and when he looks up, she is smiling. They walk to the bank of the Willamette River and sit on the grass, watching the water flow past, wide and calm. Linus skips a flat stone across the surface, 1, 2, 3 jumps before it sinks. They talk about the future, about the sunlit campus waiting for them in California, about the experiments he will design. The river continues its ancient journey to the sea, and the two young people sit in its gentle music until the first stars appear above the Coast Range. Finally, they rise and walk back through the quieting town, streetlights pooling on the pavement like puddles of melted butter. All of Corvallis seems to be holding its breath, as if the whole valley knows that one of its sons is about to step onto a much larger stage. Packing his few belongings, Linus takes a last walk through the chemistry building. The laboratory is dark now, but he knows every bench, every shelf by heart. He runs his hand along the cool, scarred surface of his workstation and looks out the window at the magnolia tree, now shedding its petals in the evening breeze. The world he is leaving is small and green and safe, but he carries it with him like a seed. On the train west, He will watch the landscape change, forests giving way to dry hills, the air growing warmer and the light sharper. But before that journey begins, there is this final moment of stillness. A single petal lands on the windowsill. Linus picks it up, places it in his notebook, and closes the door gently behind him. The corridor is empty, the floor polished gleaming faintly. He walks down the stairs and out into the night, where the future waits like a quiet, uncharted ocean. The train pulls into Pasadena on a morning so bright it almost hurts the eyes. Linus Pauling steps down onto the platform and is greeted by a wall of warm, dry air that smells of orange blossoms and dust. After the gray-green softness of Oregon, California feels like another planet. The sky is an unbroken blue, and the San Gabriel Mountains rise sharply in the distance, their peaks still dusted with winter snow. He makes his way through the quiet, palm-lined streets to the campus of the California Institute of Technology, a place people already call Caltech. The buildings are Spanish in style, with white stucco walls, red tile roofs, and shaded arcades that offer cool pockets of shadow. Bougainvillea spills over archways in cascades of magenta and coral. Linus stands for a moment in the central courtyard, listening to the trickle of a tiled fountain and the distant chime of bells from a nearby mission. The light here is different, liquid and honeyed, pouring over everything like a blessing. His new laboratory is unlike anything he has ever seen. It is modern, well-equipped, and flooded with natural light that pours through tall windows. The head of the chemistry division is Arthur Amos Noyes, a gentle, white-haired man who believes in giving young scientists freedom to pursue their own ideas. Linus is assigned a desk near a window that overlooks a garden of agave and prickly pear cactus. The view is stark but beautiful, a reminder that life can thrive even in the driest conditions. He throws himself into research on crystal structures, using X-ray diffraction to map the positions of atoms. The equipment hums and clicks, and Linus spends long hours developing photographic plates in the darkroom. The darkroom is a tiny, windowless space lit only by the dim glow of a red safe light. There, in the silence, he watches images emerge slowly in the developing tray, ghostly patterns of dots and lines that reveal the hidden architecture of matter. It is like reading a secret language written by nature itself. When he steps back into the bright California sunshine, his eyes take a moment to adjust, and the world seems full of meaning waiting to be decoded. He settles into a quiet rhythm in Pasadena. In the mornings, he walks to campus along streets shaded by towering eucalyptus trees, their bark peeling in long, curling strips. The air is filled with the scent of their oil, a sharp, medicinal fragrance that clears his mind. He passes small, Spanish-style houses with wrought iron gates and gardens full of roses and lavender. At Caltech, he spends the day in the laboratory or in the library, a beautiful room with high ceilings and large tables where the afternoon light falls in golden rectangles. In the evenings, he writes letters to Ava Helen, describing everything he sees and thinks. He tells her about the new friends he is making, other young scientists who share his passion for understanding the invisible world. They gather on the steps of the laboratory building at sunset, talking about electron clouds and wave functions while the sky turns from orange to purple behind the mountains. These conversations are animated but not hurried. They are the slow, careful building of a new way of seeing. Ava Helen joins him in Pasadena, and they marry in a small, sunlit ceremony in the garden of a friend's house. The bride wears a simple white dress, and Linus thinks she looks like the California morning itself, bright, full of promise, and utterly beautiful. They move into a tiny cottage on a quiet street, a place with a porch and a lemon tree in the backyard. The tree is old and gnarled, but it produces an abundance of fruit, and the air around their home is always tinged with the scent of citrus. In the early days of their marriage, they explore the landscape together. On weekends, they drive into the mountains in a borrowed car, following winding roads that climb through chaparral until they reach stands of pine and cedar. They hike to waterfalls hidden in fern-filled canyons and sit on boulders warmed by the sun, talking quietly about the future. Linus often brings a small notebook in which he sketches diagrams of molecules, explaining his ideas to Ava Helen in simple, poetic terms. She listens, asks questions, and sometimes suggests a new way to think about a problem. She is not a chemist, but her mind is sharp and clear, and Linus comes to rely on her instincts. Back in the laboratory, Linus begins to formulate the ideas that will make him famous. He combines the new quantum mechanics developed in Europe with the practical facts of chemistry. He imagines electrons as waves, spreading out around atomic nuclei in patterns that determine how atoms connect. This is a radical new vision, and he works it out slowly, filling blackboard after blackboard with equations in his neat handwriting. The blackboards are mounted on easels, and he moves between them like a composer shaping a symphony. Colleagues drift in and out, watching in respectful silence. The calmer he becomes, the deeper his concentration. He stands before the equations and feels a profound sense of order, a universe where everything connects through these delicate, mathematical dances. The light in the room changes as the afternoon wears on, the shadows lengthening across the floor. Linus takes off his glasses, rubs his eyes, and walks to the window. Outside, the world continues in its quiet way. A gardener raking leaves, a cat stretching in a patch of sun, the mountains patient and still. During these years, Linus and Ava Helen start a family. Their first child, a boy, is born in the master bedroom of the cottage, with the lemon tree visible through the window. Linus holds his son for the first time and feels an overwhelming sense of connection, not just to the child, but to the great chain of life that stretches back to the first cells on Earth. He thinks about the molecules inside this tiny, perfect body, the hemoglobin in the blood, the proteins building every cell. Chemistry is no longer an abstract pursuit, it is the stuff of life itself. As his children grow, the cottage fills with the sounds of laughter, crying, and the pattering of small feet. Linus builds a sandbox in the shade of the lemon tree and sets up a swing from a sturdy branch. After dinner, he reads aloud from books of fairy tales, his voice low and rhythmic, and he notices that the same patterns of story, repetition, variation, resolution, echo the patterns he sees in science. The world is a unified whole, and his life is becoming a living proof of it. The evenings end with the children asleep, the house quiet, and the two of them sitting on the porch, watching the stars come out over the mountains. Ava Helen rests her head on his shoulder, and they breathe together in the fragrant California night. By the early 1930s, Linus is ready to present his ideas to the world. He writes a series of papers that will become the foundation of modern chemistry, explaining the nature of the chemical bond with a clarity never before achieved. The scientific community takes notice. He is invited to give lectures, and his name begins to carry weight. But at home, he remains the same gentle, curious man. He still walks the Caltech arcades, still watches the hummingbirds in the garden, still takes his children to the tide pools at Laguna Beach, where they crouch together examining sea stars and anemones in the shallow, sun-warmed water. The tide pools are miniature worlds, teeming with life, and Linus points out how the shape of each creature is determined by the same chemical rules he studies. The children do not fully understand, but they feel his enthusiasm, and they grow up believing that the world is full of wonder. As the sun sets over the Pacific, the family packs up their picnic basket and drives home, the car windows down, the air smelling of salt and sage. Linus looks in the rearview mirror at his sleeping children, their faces relaxed and peaceful, and he knows with absolute certainty that the bonds holding his own world together are the strongest of all. A remarkable period of peace and productivity settles over Linus Pauling's life in the middle of the 1930s. He travels to Europe on a Guggenheim Fellowship, crossing the Atlantic on an ocean liner that cuts through calm seas under endless skies. On board, he spends his days in a deck chair, wrapped in a wool blanket, reading the latest papers in quantum physics. The ocean stretches in all directions, a vast, breathing entity the color of slate and silver. At night, he stands at the railing, watching the stars and thinking about electrons. The wind carries the salt spray, and he fills his lungs with the clean, cold air. When the ship docks in England, he steps onto land feeling that he has arrived at the center of a great intellectual awakening. He visits laboratories in London, Munich, and Copenhagen, meeting the giants of physics whose names he has known for years. In Copenhagen, Niels Bohr receives him in a quiet, book-lined study, and they talk for hours while the northern light, pale and crystalline, streams through the windows. Bohr speaks in a soft, halting voice, choosing each word with care, and Linus listens with the attention of a man who knows he is in the presence of wisdom. These European months are like a long, slow meditation on the nature of things. In Zurich, he works with physicists who challenge his ideas and push him to think more deeply. The laboratory there is housed in an old stone building near the lake, and every day Linus walks to work along cobblestone streets, past fountains and flower boxes overflowing with geraniums. The Swiss air is crisp and clear, and the mountains in the distance are covered in snow even in summer. In the evenings, he writes to Ava Helen, who has stayed in California with the children. His letters are long and detailed, filled with descriptions of the places he sees and the ideas blooming in his mind. He misses her terribly, and the ache of their separation only sharpens his focus. He works late into the night, alone in the lab except for the quiet hum of instruments. The windows grow dark and the city outside settles into sleep, but Linus keeps his lamp on, filling page after page with calculations. The peace of the empty building feels sacred, a cathedral of science where he is the sole worshipper. Upon returning to Pasadena, Linus begins to write the book that will distill all his thinking into a single, masterful statement. The book will be called The Nature of the Chemical Bond. He writes it in a small study at home, a room lined with bookshelves and centered on a heavy oak desk. The desk faces a window that looks out onto the lemon tree and, beyond it, a slice of the mountains. Every morning, he rises before dawn, makes a pot of coffee, and goes to his study. The house is still and dark except for the pool of light from his desk lamp. He writes in longhand, the words flowing with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent decades preparing for this moment. The scratch of his pen is the only sound. As the sun rises, the light changes from gray to gold, and Linus pauses to watch the mountains emerge from the shadows. The world is waking up, and he feels in perfect harmony with its rhythms. The book is not just a textbook, it is a work of art. In it, Linus explains how atoms combine to form molecules using clear language and elegant diagrams. He introduces concepts like electronegativity, resonance, and hybrid orbitals, ideas that will become the common language of chemistry around the world. He works on the book for nearly 2 years, revising each chapter with the patience of a sculptor. Ava Helen reads every draft, suggesting clarifications, catching errors. Their collaboration is quiet and constant, built on years of shared life and mutual respect. In the afternoons, when the heat of the day settles in, Linus takes a break to play with the children or work in the garden. He pulls weeds from around the roses, his hands moving automatically while his mind rests. The garden is a small, peaceful world, alive with ladybugs and butterflies. He watches a spider spin its web between 2 branches, and he marvels at the molecular precision of the silk. Everything is connected, and he is simply describing one layer of a vast, beautiful puzzle. When The Nature of the Chemical Bond is published in 1939, the scientific community recognizes it as an instant classic. The praise comes in from all over the world, but Linus receives it quietly. He continues to teach his classes at Caltech, walking through the arcades with his head slightly bowed, deep in thought. His lectures are famous for their clarity and enthusiasm. He stands at the blackboard, chalk in hand, and builds molecules stroke by stroke for his students. The lecture hall is a warm, wooden room with tall windows that rattle slightly when the wind blows. Students fill every seat, leaning forward to catch every word. Linus speaks without notes, his voice calm and even, his eyes bright. He makes the invisible visible, and the room hums with the quiet energy of discovery. After class, he lingers to answer questions, never rushing, always treating each student with the same gentle attention he gives to the most complex problem. Outside, the campus is golden under the California sun, and the students drift away in 2s and 3s, their minds opened to a larger world. As the 1930s give way to the 40s, the world outside the peaceful Caltech campus grows darker. News from Europe becomes more dire, and Linus feels a growing unease. He is a scientist, a seeker of truth, and he cannot ignore the suffering of humanity. He begins to speak out about the responsibility of scientists to work for peace, a conviction that will shape the second half of his life. But for now, in this brief, golden moment between discoveries, he has given the world a new way to understand matter itself. The bond, he has shown, is the foundation of everything from the simplest molecule to the most complex organism. And bonds, he senses, are also what hold people together, the bonds of love, of family, of shared purpose. On a quiet evening in the garden, with the lemon tree casting long shadows across the lawn, Linus takes Ava Helen's hand. They sit in the fading light without speaking because words are not needed. The mountains turn purple, then blue, then disappear into the night. The stars come out, one by one, and Linus looks up at them, thinking of the atoms that compose them, the same atoms that compose him and his wife and the lemon tree and the entire world. It is a communion as old as time, and he feels it to his core. Peace, like a river, has a way of finding new courses. As the world recovered from war, Linus Pauling turned his attention to the biggest puzzle of all, the chemistry of life itself. He began to think about proteins, those long chains of amino acids that do the work of every cell. No one knew what shape they took, and the problem was considered one of the grand challenges of science. Linus approached it with his characteristic calm, as if he were simply exploring a new room in a familiar house. He spent hours in his Caltech office, a quiet, book-filled space on the third floor of the chemistry building, where the late afternoon sun painted golden rectangles on the carpet. The office had a large blackboard, and on it he drew spirals and zigzags, trying to picture how a protein chain might fold. He played with models made of wood and wire, twisting them gently in his hands until they took on shapes that felt right. The models were kept in a glass cabinet, and when the light struck them, they cast intricate shadows on the wall, like molecular ghosts whispering secrets. One night, stuck at home with a cold, Linus sat in bed with a piece of paper and a pencil. The house was quiet, the children asleep, and Ava Helen reading in the next room. He began to doodle spirals, repeating the same curve over and over. Suddenly, he saw it, a perfect helix, a spiral staircase that the atoms could climb. The alpha helix, as he would call it, was a structure so elegant that it had to be right. He worked out the dimensions, calculating the rise and the turn, and by morning he knew he had unlocked one of nature's deepest secrets. He walked out into the garden as the sun rose, the air cool and still, and felt a quiet elation. The lemon tree was in bloom, its white flowers releasing a sweet perfume. Linus looked at the blossoms and thought about the proteins that made them grow, the helical structures that were even now weaving life out of sunlight and soil. It was one of those moments when the boundary between science and poetry disappears, and the world reveals itself as a single, magnificent fabric. The discovery of the alpha helix opened the door to a new kind of science, molecular biology. Linus began to investigate how proteins are built, how they function, and what happens when they go wrong. He turned his attention to hemoglobin, the red protein in blood that carries oxygen. He learned that in some people, hemoglobin is defective and their red blood cells take on a sickle shape instead of a smooth round one. This sickle cell anemia was a mystery, but Linus, with his deep understanding of the bond, was among the first to call it a molecular disease, a disorder caused by a tiny change in the structure of a single molecule. He described this idea in a quiet, persuasive paper that shifted the way medicine thought about illness. The work was done in a laboratory filled with the soft hum of machines and the gentle pink glow of centrifuges. Technicians moved with practiced grace, and Linus often sat at a microscope, his eye to the lens, lost in the otherworldly landscape of cells and crystals. Outside the lab window, a eucalyptus tree swayed in the wind, its leaves shimmering silver green. The world was beautiful at every scale, from the spiral of a galaxy to the spiral of a protein. During these years, the Pauling household on Arden Road became a center of warm, intellectual hospitality. The large, comfortable house sat under the shade of oaks, its rooms filled with books, art, and the sound of spirited but friendly debate. Colleagues from around the world came to visit, and Linus and Ava Helen would host long, leisurely dinners on the patio. The patio was paved with old brick and surrounded by pots of geraniums and rosemary. Candles flickered in glass holders, and the talk drifted from science to politics to philosophy. Ava Helen, always the calm center, made sure everyone felt welcome. The children, now growing older, joined these gatherings and absorbed the atmosphere of open inquiry and kindness. After dinner, the guests would walk into the garden, where the lemon tree, still bearing fruit, stood as a quiet reminder of continuity. The stars wheeled overhead, and someone might point out a constellation, and then the talk would turn to the elements forged in those distant fires. Linus would smile, his face illuminated softly by the candlelight, and say something that made everyone pause and think. But even in this peaceful time, the larger world pressed in. The Cold War was in full swing, and nuclear weapons cast a shadow over everything. Linus could not remain silent. He began to speak out against the testing of atomic bombs, using his scientific authority to explain the dangers of radioactive fallout. He gave speeches in calm, measured tones, never raising his voice, but presenting facts that were impossible to ignore. He stood on picket lines outside the White House, a tall, dignified figure holding a sign, while the Washington rain fell softly on his coat. The White House picket lines were quiet affairs, not angry confrontations. People of all ages stood together, their breath misting in the cold air, their signs made of poster board and wood. Linus would walk slowly in a line with others, his face serene, his thoughts turned to his wife and children and the kind of world they would inherit. He believed that scientists had a duty to humanity, not just to discovery, and he pursued this duty with the same patience he had applied to the chemical bond. The result of his peace activism, combined with his scientific genius, was a second Nobel Prize, this time for peace. In 1963, the day the announcement came, Linus was at the ranch in Big Sur that he and Ava Helen had bought as a retreat. The ranch was a wild, beautiful place on the edge of the continent, where the Santa Lucia Mountains plunged into the Pacific. The house was simple, made of redwood, with large windows that looked out over the ocean. The morning fog was just lifting, revealing a vast, blue expanse dotted with the white specks of seabirds. Linus stood on the deck with a cup of coffee, watching the waves break far below. He thought about the long path that had led him here, from his father's pharmacy, through the Oregon woods, the Caltech arcades, the lecture halls of Europe, and he felt a deep, quiet gratitude. He would accept the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo later that year, traveling with Ava Helen through a city dressed in its winter clothes, the palaces and churches frosted with snow. In his acceptance speech, he spoke softly about the need to abolish war, his words falling into the silence of the Grand Hall like stones into a still pond. He was the same man who had once watched glass bottles glow in a rainy Portland night, and the peace he now spoke of was an extension of the same search for harmony. In the later years of his life, Linus Pauling found himself drawn to a new and controversial subject, vitamin C. He became convinced that large doses of the vitamin could prevent colds, fight cancer, and extend life. The scientific establishment pushed back hard, but Linus approached this battle with the same calm conviction he had brought to everything. He wrote a book called Vitamin C and the Common Cold and spoke about its benefits in his gentle, reasonable voice. The cottage in Big Sur became the center of this new chapter. The ranch was a place of wild beauty, where the ocean and the mountains met in a slow, eternal embrace. Hawks circled overhead, and whales passed by on their long migrations. Linus and Ava Helen walked along the cliffs each morning, following narrow paths through the coastal sage. The air was sharp with the scent of salt and crushed herbs. They gathered wild berries and watched the sea otters floating on their backs in the kelp beds. In this setting, far from the laboratories and lecture halls, the controversy seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was the immediate reality of health, love, and the turning of the seasons. The house itself was filled with light. The windows faced west, and every evening the setting sun flooded the rooms with colors that changed from gold to rose to deep violet. Linus had a study there, simpler than his Caltech office, with a desk made of reclaimed redwood. He read stacks of letters from people who believed vitamin C had helped them, and he answered each one in his careful, sloping handwriting. The letters came from all over the world, and they formed a mountain of paper that he and Ava Helen sorted through together. It was a quiet ministry, this correspondence, a way of extending care beyond the boundaries of science. In the afternoons, Linus would nap in a hammock strung between two cypress trees, the sound of the waves lulling him to sleep. The hammock swayed gently, and the sun dappled through the needles. When he woke, he would often find Ava Helen nearby, reading or knitting, and they would sit together without speaking, simply being. They entertained visitors at the ranch, scientists, peace activists, artists, and old friends. The gatherings were easy and informal. People sat on the deck with glasses of lemonade, watching the pelicans glide in formation over the surf. The conversation drifted from topic to topic like clouds across the sky. Sometimes Linus would tell the story of his life, not as a lecture, but as a series of quiet moments that had led him here. He spoke of the pharmacy in Portland, the rainy walks to school, the first time he saw a crystal structure emerge on a photographic plate. His voice was slow and rhythmic, and his listeners would fall into a peaceful trance, soothed by the sound of his words and the distant boom of the surf. There was no rush, no urgency. Time seemed to stretch out in this place, as if the ranch existed in a pocket of the world where clocks ran slower. The sunsets were long and elaborate, each one a masterpiece. As the years passed, Ava Helen's health began to decline. Linus became her constant caregiver, tending to her with the same meticulous attention he had once given to his laboratory. He prepared her meals, adjusted her pillows, and read to her for hours at a time. The books they shared were often poetry, Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, words that distilled large truths into small, manageable stanzas. From the window of her sick room, Ava Helen could see the ocean, and its presence was a comfort. They talked about their life together, the places they had seen, the children and grandchildren. They did not speak much about grief. Instead, they focused on gratitude. Linus held her hand, and they watched the light change on the water. When she died in 1981, Linus felt a loss so profound that it seemed to rearrange his molecules. But he did not fall apart. He continued his work, sustained by the habits of a lifetime and the beauty of the place they had loved together. He lived for another 13 years, and the ranch remained his sanctuary. He rose early each day, made his bed, and prepared a simple breakfast. Then he would go to his study and work on the ideas that still interested him, from nuclear disarmament to the structure of atomic nuclei. His mind never lost its sharpness, but his pace slowed. He walked more slowly along the cliffs, often stopping to admire a wildflower or a particularly beautiful arrangement of rocks. He became a familiar figure in the small town of Big Sur, a tall, white-haired man in a worn jacket, buying groceries at the tiny market or eating a bowl of soup at the local cafe. The locals knew who he was, but they treated him with a quiet respect that he appreciated. He was not a celebrity here. He was just Linus, the man who lived on the sea cliff and never stopped being curious about the world. In the evenings, he would sit on the deck and watch the sun go down. The ritual never grew old. He would take a glass of water, sometimes plain, sometimes with a dissolved vitamin C tablet fizzing at the bottom, and settle into his chair. The ocean stretched before him, empty and eternal. The sky would begin its slow transformation, and Linus would let his mind wander. He thought about his father and the pharmacy, about Ava Helen and their first walk by the Willamette River, about the moment the alpha helix bloomed in his imagination. All these moments were still alive inside him, held together by the bonds of memory. Then the sun would touch the horizon, a perfect orange sphere, and the water would catch fire for a few brief minutes. He would watch until the last sliver disappeared, and then he would sit in the deepening dusk, listening to the waves and the first rustle of night creatures in the sage. A great peace would settle over him, the peace of a life fully lived, of questions asked and answered, of love given and received. The stars would come out, and Linus would look up, naming them in his mind: hydrogen, helium, lithium, the simplest elements, the building blocks of everything. He was one with them, returning slowly to the cosmic dust from which he came. And he was not afraid.